We got stuck. I will just look at him and he will take over. And the presentation, I will first discuss in general about APIs, and then show you a real-world example using one implementation, using one type of APIs, using one language. Before that, let's. The concept of API, of course, is to separate your internal systems. You will have an API team who will have access to your internal system, look at it, and decide what things can be exposed and what they can't, and expose it using an API. And on the other end, you will have an app developer, which will be, in your case, your customer. You are when you're writing an API, your customer is not the end user of the applications. Your customer is their developer. So you're going to design your API in a way that it will be useful for him. And of course, then the app developer will write an app and maybe put it in an app store, and the end user will eventually use it. So this part is where we will be looking at options of where to store this backend or where to host it. One is using infrastructure as a service, like Amazon Web Services, EC2, and writing your own code and placing it there. The other is using platform as a service provider like App Engine or Heroku or other providers, and hosting your code there. Or even using Windows Azure. Or you can use...
We don't say Windows Azure, it's a dirty word.
Azure? Huh?
We don't say Windows Azure, it's a dirty word. We don't use it in Google sponsor.
Thank you, man. Thank you. هذا كوين. It's there already. وبعدين you cut.
I did the towel.
يلا.
3 backs on the desk.
الله أكبر. يلا. Go ahead.
Okay. And the other option is using ready-made or ready services that give you AAAS.
This is
API as a service.
Please, I don't need you to expand on this.
Don't pronounce it. Okay, it's API as a service.
Triple A's or triple A?
Not triple. As a. So it's API as a service. Like one of the major things is ones are parse and also Apigee, which I will be using their slides, by the way, in a while. Or the option that we will be using, which is Django REST framework. Django REST framework uses Django, and it's just like a simple Django app that enables you to expose your models, your Django models, through an API, and include a lot of options like pagination, like authentication, like you using serializer that will precisely decide what are you exposing through the API. And you'll see the demo, it's very simple. These are some of the features. The authentication, of course, you can use OAuth 1A and you can use OAuth 2 out of the box without having to include anything. And there are a lot of serializers because sometimes you don't want to expose like direct mapping of the things you're storing. You need to parse it or manipulate it somehow. So the serializers can enable you to do that. And it has an extensive documentation and a great community around it.
About the OAuth, why do you use it if you're using your own API?
Even if you're using your own API, because sometimes you want to ship your application. You don't want to hard code it I want to go back to here. If you are exposing it to a large number of developer community, it's best to have them use OAuth.
If you are not.
Especially if they are exposing details of end users through this API. If you are not, it's like one-off. Sometimes, in some use cases, it's okay to hard code even passwords or it's never a good idea. But sometimes the OAuth is like an overkill for this. But you can do a lot of things like tokens. It's not always the whole OAuth dance with multiple three entities is not necessary for every use case. But for cases like Twitter, because Twitter, you are the developer and you want to access users' information. You want to be access to their direct messages or their stream of even users who are protected. So you need to authenticate your application for their API and also authenticate the user. So the user is OAuth is like a replacement for passwords, because in the past,
Like what you don't want is your site get hacked and your passwords are exposed for users.
Yeah.
And you're liable.
yeah, like 10
That's
years
the main
ago.
reason we use OAuth.
Yeah, like 10 years ago, it was common for people to ask for your password. If I want to have a service that access my, let's say, Twitter account or something similar to Twitter, it was normal to just give them your password. You trust them; they will store your password, and if they get hacked, all their users will be hacked. So
وتروح.
yeah, so OAuth is it's like a long password, a long hashed password that if your site gets compromised, or if even the user decides that he doesn't want to give you access to the account anymore, he can just deactivate it. And a way to avoid having to expose the password.
Like a third party
Can we
encryption.
take a pause? Can you go?
The element itself.
This one, it's on shelf. I think it can take.
So it's
12.
virgins, and virgin number, then the...
Just V1, V2.
Yeah,
Even
but I'm assuming that before V1 is the header.
You are no.
this is
the convention. Okay, so if you want the API to give you exactly what you need, because again, if you are accessing it from a mobile, even sometimes the payload is way larger than the user will consume all his quota on just fetching one request. So you can even ask what do you want. Like instead of select star, you can get the field names that you want. This is something similar. You include the fields that you want in a comma-separated list.
But for this, you assume that you already authenticated the user and you allowed that.
Yeah, of course. This is the
Before you can
authentication.
fetch.
Yeah, the authentication will be sent along with the request. So if he doesn't have, if he's not authorized to access this resource, he will not be able to access the row itself, let alone the.
So authentication comes first before the /Joe Smith, for example.
You mean column level authentication, or authentication in general?
Just to retrieve like a list of, we were talking before, it's dogs, for example.
Yeah.
The list of all dogs. Can I just retrieve it like that, or
If you have
the
access,
request?
if the request is authenticated,
Okay.
sometimes you have to
Depends on
on
the
a
API.
higher level.
Yeah.
So the API will filter the records that it's sending to you. So it's filtered on a higher level than that.
About what he asked, Twitter version 1 API. When you retrieve the tweets,
just to convert the resources.
version 1 without authentication, you can retrieve.
For
Version-
any user.
Yeah, for any user, you can retrieve. In version 1.1,
Batteries are
you should
good?
use
I think you're affecting
authentication.
mine.
Along with the request, you send the
Yeah, you will
username.
do the authentication, then you will get a token. Then
Okay.
for each request, you will send the
Yeah.
token.
One each request.
Yeah.
So this is how
Just in URL, is it possible to put colons and commas and brackets?
anything there.
Yeah.
Is it possible to put in URL comma, colons and brackets?
Yeah. Comma, it will parse it as a list. If you have something like fields and then comma separated list, it can be parsed as
Yes,
it's identifying it as
That's a keyboard.
yeah.
مشكلتك مع الريموت.
بطارية.
Anyway, it's not that far. It's not that far. So you can do that. You can have lists, comma separated list. And if you want, this is the convention for doing this. Pagination, you asked about. This is how Facebook does it. You include an offset and a limit. So it limits the number of items. And offset, you start from that offset, just like SQL. Twitter does the same thing, but with different names. I think I used Instagram. Instagram, they are very stingy and cheap with the limits. They only give you 50, I think, or 100 max when you want to consume more. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. So this is the correct convention. Just limit and offset. And usually, when you in Instagram, for example, when you get the list, it will give you also the pagination, the next URL. Yeah. So if you can hook this to your call to the as an offset of the next set of things that you are going to parse. About formats, Google does it this way, including
using the same alt in Google is because by default it's XML. So you're requesting an alternate format.
An alternate format, yeah, this is the and Foursquare, and I think also Facebook does this.
Twitter.
Also Twitter, yeah, .json. Like, who still uses the thing? This is how they recommend to do it. Yeah, did you guys? Do you agree with this or with
for
with a question mark and
proper, if you want to be really strict, it should be based on the content type requested.
on a content type?
You parse the header. So if the content type requested is text HTML, you return HTML. If it's XML, you return XML. If it's JSON, you return JSON.
Okay. So you include it with the so not you don't.
It's too expensive to change the.
Yeah.
So that's why
they-
doing it in the URL is much easier.
Defaults. I think if I'm beyond design one, of course the default's going to be JSON. And the defaults for pagination, you can include whatever arbitrary limit you want, and the offset, of course, is 0. So again, Instagram will give you by default 50 users or 50 pages.
If you're seeing others' account, if you're seeing your account, I think it should give you 1,000.
1,000? Oh, okay. But if your list of users, for example, to give you 50, but you can override it, so you can include whatever sensible defaults you want. Attributes names. Sometimes they use created at.
The key thing about here is it's not the attribute name that's important, it's the format of the data you're sending. It doesn't matter what the attribute name is. Always send UTC.
Yeah.
Don't send timestamp information.
Yeah, we learned this the hard way. Huh?
Yeah, universal time coordinate.
Okay. I think it's the first line.
It's the first line. The one where it's plus
Yeah,
000, there's no times on offset.
So UTC.
Yeah, or you send the Unix timestamp, which is the last one, which is first.
I think it is.
Which is the reason you don't want to recommend this, the epoch, is because if you have a date that's that starts before the epoch, you'll be stuck.
Yeah.
Because the epoch starts in
1971.
and then 1970 January 1 is the start of the epoch.
Yeah.
But in which time zone also is this epoch?
No, the epoch is just UTC. It's the starting of the clock. So it's January 1, 1970, UTC.
UTC.
Sometimes it depends on the machine itself. It doesn't depend on the time. It depends on the time zone.
Otherwise you would have Y2K bugs every day.
The machine, when it starts up, it doesn't tell you on which time zone.
Yeah,
Like
because
the DOS.
the thing is, the epoch is always the same. The epoch is used as a reference from a time.
Yes.
It's not the time. It's a reference from a known time. It's
the
like
number-
year 0. So you always know when is year 0, and you have an offset from there. So the epoch is an offset from a certain point in time.
1970.
Which is 1970, January 1, 1970. If you have a date before the epoch, okay, then you have to do some finagling, which is why they recommend you don't send the epoch. Unless you know, like Foursquare, doubt that they will have anyone there
Yeah, checking in.
checking in before 1970.
Their use case, yeah.
Their use case, right? But if you are sending a timestamp, send it with a known timestamp format. Generally accepted is the one that JavaScript uses by default, which I believe is the second one, the main one. Okay. But the key thing to remember is you don't send a time zone specific time. Even if you're storing, first of all, don't store any time zones in your system. Always store UTC time or the epoch if it applies to you. And then based on the client that's being requested, you convert it at that time. You convert it at the time of display. You don't store it
At the display time, yeah.
at the display time.
So JSON for the JavaScript objects. What are they continuing?
Attribute names.
Yeah, attribute names, yeah.
In other words, what they're saying is, if you go back, you see created at, get time created at.
Yeah.
So if you go front now, when you have an underscore, an attribute name, that's what they're saying it looks front.
Yeah.
Okay? That's what they're saying. Because if you're returning JSON, there's a convention in JavaScript that identifiers follow a certain pattern.
Yeah.
So make sure your attributes follow that pattern.
Yeah.
It's just being nice for the consumer.
So you follow the naming conventions of JavaScript.
If you're sending JSON.
Yeah, if you're sending JSON. And the convention is first one not capitalized,
Call
and
it,
the second. Camel case,
Camel
or camel case is when they're all.
Yeah.
No, case.
First
When the first one is not, yeah. Okay, what about non-resources stuff? You want to calculate, translate, convert. You use verbs, not nouns, because this you are telling them in advance that this is some calculation is done. It's not just like a resource that's resting and serving it to you. No, there is a calculation that's being done there. So the convention here is to use the endpoint as a verb. Searching, of course, there. If it's global, you will have a separate endpoint. If it's scoped, you can add it after the item you're searching.
The key thing to remember is it's always a queue.
It's always
Query.
query.
It's always query.
Search code.
It's not query QERY. It's not K.
Capital Q, yeah.
It's always small letters.
Small Q, yeah.
And that Django will do that.
Counts. Some people serve it directly, so if you want to get the number of counts, no need to fetch it and count it on the client level.
Yeah, I'm just saying, as it is.
Yeah. The rest of the URL. These are the conventions that are used by those guys. I think this is the most the one that makes the most sense. Any comments here, Ron?
No. The only thing I would suggest is if you are serious about developing an API for your service and you want others to consume it, keep in mind you need to cater to your customers. The customers are not the developers. The customers are not the people who are going to use the application. So that's why they say that you always have a developer community, which is very important. You don't need to spend a lot of time and money on it. You just need a central place, this documentation published about the API. Very important, if there's a version change, you mention it and you mention what's backward incompatible. Especially if your resources are going to be changing.
Yeah, it's gonna break the.
Yeah, if you're going to break that. The other thing is, even if you are on version 0, or it's the very first API you have created, always add a version type. Always. There's no, don't launch it unless you have, just put V1. Just by default have V1 in all your APIs.
Because eventually you
Why?
since you have the luxury of.
And then the other thing that you do is, when you upgrade your API from V1 to V2, don't simply go ahead and change all V1 to V2. No, have V1 still running, have V2 still running, give it a termination date, okay, and at that date, is redirect or return a 404 not found from the V1. Don't kill the URL. Return a meaningful message, and in the error code say API expired.
Deprecated.
Deprecated code. don't just comment it out and then harass the developer doesn't know what's going on. Okay? You can always return a 500, and then in the error code you can say that you can please see.
Every time we're gonna have it here because we want them to show up.
Well, Mohammed, we miss you.
Yeah, so you're for me, huh?
it's coming for you.
Thanks.
Actually, صفوق.
How many slides do you have? 6?
Or I'm gonna just swift through them.
It's 83 of 106.
Okay, I'm just gonna show it push up. Abu Yusuf. So, Abu Yusuf the Tarbiyah. Abu Yusuf the second. Okay, I'm gonna go very fast because we will have time to show the live demo. Client intercepts HTTP code errors. We can, of course, this is HTTP. This is HTTP. This is a convention that's.
What they're saying here is, if you're offering a way to return a non-error code for HTTP, which is 200 here, make sure you return the error condition in the body of the message. That's what they're trying to say. Because some clients, if the error code, if the response code is not 200 or 2xx something or 30 something, their server might drop the request. So a client may ask you, don't change the HTTP service code in the body of the message, in the payload, return me the error. So instead of looking for the HTTP service code, they're going to look for the key. If the key has error in the body of the message, they're going to assume that the request had an error. So to keep for that flexibility, they're saying offer a modifier on your URL, which is suppress error response, true. If you suppress error response true, this means that the response returned from your API will not reflect the HTTP error code. It will always return 200, even if there was an error in the request. And then you return the error in the message.
Yeah.
In the payload of the request.
Yeah.
That's what they're trying to say.
I disagree here.
It's an option.
It's an option. You can provide this as an option.
So you should have
See, it says always returns okay.
and have some meaningful, of course, defaults for. Are there a default for the name?
No, because here the response code is the response code it would have sent. You got it? So it would have sent a 401 in case of this request. But
it's sending 200 and giving you much better.
So if you are really keen on having a solid developer community, you always want to have a dictionary of error response codes versus what their meaning is or what possible outcomes. So here you say code is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he can go and look at the dev website for that code and see what could have possibly triggered that.
Discussion. This is being nice to your developers, your customers. So clients, if the client supports limited HTTP methods, so you have create, read, update, delete. This is if it can't send it, you include it in.
This is for the benefit of those developers who don't